The secrets of our times are coded in the games we play.
Video games say a lot about the period in which they were created.
Video games are an expressive and representative art form.
An art form that was born in an era filled with fear.
No one can foresee precisely what costs or casualties will be incurred.
Isn't it nice that something like Cold War technology could, in its own adversarial way, spawn something that was adversarial in a really pleasurable way?
Video games will lead us into the future with eyes wide open.
It's a very, very complex and powerful art form, and the best is yet to come.
How strange all this began with the push of a button. Video games are the future of entertainment, a multi-billion-dollar industry that has drawn our world into its digital domain.
Video games are not just art, but they're culture, their creativity. They represent, in many ways, a more complex structure than a good movie.
First of all, CPUs are awesome now. They're really fast. Video card acceleration basically makes games really immersive. Screens are bigger now. You feel like you are really there.
Oh, video!
Producing a video game today is like producing a movie.
And action!
It takes 100, 150 people, costs $10 million.
Stop. Wait, go back.
From the beginning, video games have been a reflection of the times.
What games do, like any form of entertainment, is they actually are a way for us to kind of have a perspective on our existence, on human existence, just like books do, just like movies do, just like in its own way music does.
In our world, staying connected is essential. Yet even beyond video games, pushing a button today is simply a part of living in the 21st century. However, a mere 50 years ago, citizens of the world wanted nothing to do with one particular button: the red button.
When people think about the idea of pushing the button, in the 50s, that didn't mean pushing the button to play a video game. It meant pushing the button to end the world.
1, 0.
I was right next to a place called Hill Air Force Base. We felt we would be one of the big targets.
We heard about all the fears in Russia. We have the special course in the schools and in colleges about so-called civil defense, how we should act in case of some kind of mass destruction.
The Cold War is becoming evident. With about 5 million Red Army troops and 2 million internal security.
Our nations teetered on the precipice of a Cold War, and early computer technology emerged to render our collective fear.
No one can foresee precisely what course it will take, or what costs or casualties will be incurred.
The Cold War was an elongated stretch of diplomatic conflict between the communist world and the free world. It was a war that was called cold because it never really flared up into open conflict.
President Kennedy ordered a blockade of Cuba and demanded that Russia remove this threat to peace.
The Cold War was a matter of pitting one simulation against another. The games are a technology about simulation. We use them to model real-world processes, to predict results. And to some degree, that's exactly what was taking place in Washington and Moscow. It's like one global version of the game Battleship.
To protect the future of America, defense techniques of tomorrow had to be discovered now.
The Cold War was nothing but a simulation to begin with. So there is no war to study. There's only these possible future wars, these fears of war, these probable outcomes.
While the sirens wailed their grim warning, hundreds of thousands of
These virtual simulations and early Cold War computers reflected our fears, but they couldn't allay them. The player couldn't control the missiles.
People like predictable worlds with predictable outcomes, or at least controllable outcomes, or at least the perception that if you got the skill, you could control it. That's very satisfying. Because the world in general is pretty uncontrollable and a little bit daunting sometimes.
The first computer game would soon arise from the technology of the Cold War, and the world, simulated or otherwise, would never be the same.
Will be 40 seconds. Be aware you have tango flight ahead of us.
In the 50s, the Cold War had launched the development of computer technology for combat and missile simulations.
This is part of the military strength of the United States.
As the rehearsal for war intensified, a young physicist working in a nuclear lab forever changed how the world viewed the button. In 1958, William Willie Higginbotham, who had worked on the first atomic bomb, turned two rudimentary lines and a bouncing ball into the first interactive entertainment experience on a computer, Tennis for Two.
Every weekend they would have these contests to see who could come up with the coolest thing. Yeah, Willie Higginbotham came up with this idea that you could take an oscilloscope and make a tennis game out of it.
It was an expression of a kind of rebellious adolescent energy, working alongside the military projects, taking this most expensive piece of equipment at the time and repurposing it to play games.
Suddenly, computers had a use beyond military computations. But as the war evolved, so would the games and the players.
Laika, first space traveler, was ready for the takeoff, and here it is.
And I do remember all this noise about the dogs coming in the space. I even remember their names, you know, Belka and Strelka and whatever, you know.
Shortly after Laika's flight, the Russian man-in-space program began. The same centrifuge that tested Laika was now adapted for human experiments.
Definitely Gagarin's flight was a very big deal in 61.
Major Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin was launched into orbit around the Earth.
Yuri Gagarin had taken the first steps into outer space for the USSR, but America wasn't far behind.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
The Cold War became a race to space.
On the space age.
And it deeply influenced Steve Russell, an MIT programmer who carried video games into the next realm with his own virtual space war.
Space race was very much in the news. And, you know, spaceships taking off, spaceships blowing up were something that you could hardly escape. And further, I had just read Doc Smith's Lesman series. These are a bunch of science fiction stories where the heroes went zooming across the galaxy, inventing new technology as they went, being pursued by the forces of pure evil.
Before he could battle the forces of pure evil, Steve Slug Russell had to master the hulking PDP-1 campus computer.
This is a PDP-1, the first computer I met like a modern personal computer. You can turn it on with one switch.
It was considered at the time a microcomputer, meaning it was only the size of a refrigerator.
It cost $120,000, and it did something simple like typing or being a desk calculator. The programs were typically called expensive, so there was expensive typewriter and expensive desk calculator.
It didn't show anything spectacular. It was so unimpressive that they kind of felt like no way, we can do, with this PDP, we can do something way cooler.
Eventually, we figured out that, well, you could have two spaceships and they could fire torpedoes at each other. Yeah, okay. That's kind of boring. Can you make something blow up? Yeah.
If Tennis for Two was a light-hearted Cold War distraction, Steve Slug Russell's game was a direct expression of the space race and the global fear of space war.
That was straight out of the times. That was, you know, that was that feeling of the Soviet paranoia, you know, communism's gonna kick our ass. I mean, that played right into the collective consciousness of society. It says, we're kind of afraid here, you know, are we gonna go to war?
It was truly remarkable and ahead of its time, and it was profoundly influential on me.
I think it was the world's most popular computer game for a couple of years, mostly because it was the only one.
The coding instructions for the game were passed from programmer to programmer, and any institution with a PDP-1 computer inevitably had a version of Space War also.
So it became open source, and we gave copies of the sources to anybody who looked and anyone who wanted them.
These were young guys in their 20s who were part of a group that we think of today as the first generation of hackers.
It wasn't so much rebellion as exploration. You know, there were all these new things to do and see. Sort of joy of a bright, shiny new erector set with lots of different new parts. And you can build things.
One of the things Steve Russell built was the foundation for what would become the most important part of any video game experience, the joystick.
Originally, the controls were just from the console switches. And then some of the Model Railroad Club guys built a control box using surplus telephone parts.
Steve Russell was also the first programmer to put destruction on the screen.
Well, one thing that I sometimes say is, I unleashed the curse of video games upon the world.
With Cold War conflicts in Korea, Berlin, and then Vietnam, the 60s threatened to drag the world into chaos. And television was there to document the drums of war. But there was no way to change what was on the screen.
Our televisions had brought us scenes of such despair. Our televisions had become the site of napalm, of little Vietnamese girls running from bombs. Our televisions were pain machines. And they were pain machines that offered us no way to adjust them.
Many U.S. colleges see the Nixon move as a red flag. They'd been demanding that the U.S. get out of Southeast Asia.
At the time, in the 70s, the television was a very passive or cold medium.
And Nixon seems now to be digging in. It's like putting a match to a giant fuse, zigzagging across the nation.
Television was a static purveyor of bad news that one man and one idea would change forever.
And all of a sudden, a video game turned it into a hot medium. You now could control what was on that set.
Ralph Baer, widely considered the Thomas Edison of video games, created the first home console system, the Magnavox Odyssey.
The whole difference between what others did and what I did is that I had the vision that there are 40 million TV sets out there that can't do anything except tune in a local 2 or 3 channels.
The Magnavox company has come up with an electronic game simulator that will transform the family TV set into a playground.
I mean, you just couldn't believe it. I mean, this was, at home, on your TV, video games? This is like crazy world. This isn't the future.
I twiddle it, moves my paddle from left to right.
Even before Baer changed the face of television, he had lived the reality of war. He escaped Nazi Germany with his family before the Holocaust and was later drafted to fight in World War II for the Americans. In what would deeply influence Baer and the history of video games, he found himself transferred to Normandy, France as an interrogator and surrounded by the tools of war.
As it turned out, there were weapons all over the place. They mostly came back from North Africa with the British. Everywhere you looked, you could find weapons. I got wrapped up in the guns. The guns have history. The guns have fascination, They're mechanical things. I come back from the war with 18 tons of small arms, foreign small arms.
But Baer had gained more than a museum collection. To mentally cope with war, he had awakened his innate love for interaction with technology, a skill that would lead him to Sanders Associates in 1958.
At the time, they made electronics for defense. And Ralph Baer was a young engineer working there whose background was in television technology.
Baer was hired to build Cold War military technology, but soon he began working on the brown box, the prototype to the first home gaming console, the Magnavox Odyssey.
We've built, we call the all-purpose box.
The box played 7 different games and allowed us to plug in a bunch of different accessories. And we produced a game that was fascinating and it survived. And you can still play today and still have fun with nothing but extremely crude symbology on the screen.
You want to score, Bill? Sure. Okay, 1-0.
We'll play a conservative game. Doggone these switches. Here we go. Now I'm going to do a little English on you. Oops. Damn.
Ralph Baer had changed how the world viewed television forever. But like the pioneers before him, all the fun and games were funded by US dollars.
If you have a really serious and very techie job, you're looking for a little bit of fun in your job, you know? And that's how really video games were born. Somebody screwing around with an oscilloscope, figuring out how to do tennis for two. And with Ralph Baer especially, you know, working in such a serious field, I think sometimes he had to sit back and really enjoy all this technology that he got to work with instead of just using it for, you know, destruction.
Like any other technology industry today, it wouldn't exist if it weren't for the military, because it was the military that was funding research into computers during World War II for things like calculating ballistic missile tables and things like that. So the video game industry and the military have been like this from the beginning.
Okay, I got you. Driver up, fire.
In the late 60s and early 70s, the counterculture movement spawned a new breed of video game impresario. And Nolan Bushnell, founder of Atari, was one of the first.
It was the age of Aquarius. We're going to build a new world order, and it's going to be based on love and harmony and things like that. Was very, very much part of the early Atari ethic.
Part of it was our youth. Part of it was the culture of the day to take risks. There was all this talk about we could be dead tomorrow. So there was sort of an attitude about living life to the fullest. Let's not postpone some of this stuff. So we were kind of that culture. Oh, let's give it a try.
People are arguing about who created the video game. There's lots of arguments, but nobody questions who created the video game business, the video game industry. That is Nolan Bushnell. He was the first guy to say, hey, we can make money off this.
No other company offers you as many different video game cartridges as Atari.
Bushnell enlisted former co-worker Al Alcorn to program the first arcade game.
He gave me my first project, which was to build a simple ping pong game with one ball moving, a net score, and he told me that he had a contract from General Electric, but he didn't really have a contract with GE.
It was just spinning him. Well, I felt that he would need to think that it wasn't just a training.
The spin paid off, and the Pong prototype was ready.
Once I'd gotten the game to where it played pretty well, Nolan said it had to have sound, and he said, I want to have the sound of a crowd approving, and somebody else said, I want to have hisses and boos if you lose. And I'm thinking, I have no idea how to make this at all. I'm already way over my budget. I got too many chips in this thing as it is. So I simply poked around with a little audio amplifier in the circuit and found tones that sounded about right and wired them in. It was less than half a chip to put those sounds in. And I said, that's it, Nolan.
He got it working in 3 days. I mean, which I was baffled by. I mean, he's so good. And then we changed one little thing. When the ball hit the different segments on the paddle, the angle went up, and all of a sudden it went from a ho-hum game to a knockout fun game. That little change was DC and daylight, night and day.
When Atari unleashed Pong on the world in 1972, the video game industry was born.
Pong was the beginning of everything. I mean, Pong was the first video game that people could play that was not inside of a lab somewhere.
So I wrote the first instructions for Pong, which was step 1, insert quarter. Step 2, ball will serve automatically. Step 3, avoid missing ball for a high score. And that's all it took. So it was very easy to play.
Any of us who was around for Pong remembers the first moment we played Pong the way people remember the Kennedy assassination, because we had the power of the pixel.
Don't watch television tonight. Play it.
I grew up in a pub in Liverpool in England, and my dad came in one day with a large piece of furniture which a couple of guys hauled into the bar that was as big as this. And of course it was Pong, the predecessor to just about every game.
The other odd thing about Pong was it was a two-player game. It required two people to play. You really couldn't play it by yourself.
Pong played more on the rock, paper, scissors of competition. It was another way for us to have a competition, for me to kick your ass and prove that, I'm the top dog.
It was just at the beginning of women's liberation.
Women and all the minorities, that all of us must stand up together and say no more.
Maybe the men aren't ready for it, but the revolution is on. The women of America are marching, more of them in the East than anywhere else.
It was very acceptable for a woman, newly liberated, to go into a bar and say, want to play Pong? I'll pay. Women have better small muscle coordination than men do. So women could play Pong in general better than men could. So this was the first time in many cases that on an equal playing field, women could whip any guy. In fact, women would come and hustle bars and make money.
Well, I think Pong comes out at a moment when America has gone through a very serious time in its history, not just Vietnam, the civil rights movement, and so forth. The 70s seems so much more frivolous looking back on it than the 60s, which is a period of intensity. I don't think the video games created that sense of frivolity. They're simply symptomatic of a tendency of people to turn inward into their own homes, to be engaged in social activities, that everyone had gotten a little serious, a little hot under the collar, and so forth. So I think that's a better way to think about it.
Even if everything was perfect in the world, there'll always be a need for entertainment.
At heart, play is basic to mammals of all kinds. Puppies play, monkeys play, human beings play. We play across all national borders. We play each other's games.
Higginbotham, Russell, Bear, Bushnell, these early pioneers, consciously or not, channeled our collective fears into their virtual creations. It was obvious that the world was weary, and video games were the perfect weapons of mass distraction all over the world. The earliest video games were byproducts of the Cold War. But in the Far East, the first games of Japan emerged in the aftermath of a more direct conflict, World War II. The atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki had ravaged the country, but Allied forces worked closely with Japan to rebuild.
Technology rapidly emerged as key to Japan's success. There's an enormous push for education through government for technology. Japanese youth are highly technologically literate during that period of time.
Japan found its niche in electronics, figuring out what the rest of the world was doing in electronics and making it better, and mass producing and making it cheaper.
But the old wounds had not yet healed.
If you look at Japanese culture after World War II, you definitely see the reflected experience of the atomic bomb in a lot of the work.
Godzilla, king of the monsters, stalking the earth, crushing all before it.
It's a period of time where Godzilla and the great rubber monster movies are coming out. So if you combine the cultural content of Godzilla with the technological power of the computer, you have something that looks like the fascination that's created by games.
Japan was at the height of the electronics industry. But in 1978, Tomohiro Nishikado put his country at the forefront of the video game industry with an endless wave of digital invaders, space invaders.
I initially thought of humans as the invaders, but the idea of humans shooting humans was criticized as inhumane. So I thought about what would be suitable and figured aliens invading instead. I figured there wouldn't be any problem shooting monsters.
Yeah, I think when you look at Space Invaders, it's not a stretch to sort of, look at the aliens in the sky and think about, planes flying over Japan, clearly weapons of mass destruction being dropped from the sky.
The thing that's interesting about Space Invaders is it was a very early fantasy scenario.
When you're playing it, you're going, we are actually being invaded, right? I personally am being invaded by these guys. I am the frontline security for mankind.
Space Invaders unlocked something in the Japanese psyche, as millions of teens played the game and triggered a 100 yen coin shortage in Japan.
And it just took off in that way that really only in Japan do things take off in that way.
You know, with video games, it was something new, it was something different. There was something to leave your house and experience. In Japan, that's particularly important because the homes are so much smaller. So teens go out there in a way that is a bit different from the United States.
We got a hint from the human heartbeat to create one of the sound effects in the game. The low tone of the ground rumbling when it was approaching. I guess we can create better sounds nowadays, but those days when we only had limited techniques and devices, that was the best we could do. But we think we came close enough.
You think about what Space Invaders did from a music and audio standpoint, and it was 4 notes. It was, dun, 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 dun. But what they did is they took the tempo, and as the invaders got closer and closer, they started to speed that up. As this music got quicker and quicker and quicker, and it started to make you panic a little as you're playing the game.
To cash in on the craze, shop owners cleared out their merchandise and set up all Space Invader arcades overnight. And the Space Invader invasion pointed to a generation gap in Japanese culture.
Lots of mums refused to let their kids play games. It became a social issue since there were kids who had stolen money or made phony coins to play games at arcades. It was said to be a serious problem concerning child education.
I think with Space Invaders, what happened was that technology for the first time created this big rift between the generations. And, the older set who thought they were up with everything and they understood what was happening in the automobile industry and with television suddenly was left behind because they couldn't figure out why this silly game was so popular.
All across the country, kids are being swept away by video games. They watch the dance.
In America, you start to see all kind of ordinances passed where, a certain number of teenagers couldn't be in a convenience store or an arcade at the same time. It really established an entire culture.
Also, the thing about those games that was a little bit sad in a way was that they inevitably ended in the player's defeat. We didn't think about it, I think, consciously at the time, but I wonder if that doesn't reflect some of that Cold War paranoia that at the end of the day, war is a defeatist game. You're going to always lose.
Space Invaders was a digital expression of a darker time, but Japan has always had a soft spot for cute, cuddly characters. Enter Pac-Man.
I mean, you were looking at this going, wow, it's so colorful.
Pac-Man is the perfect example of Japanese weirdness.
Video game characters are really adorable. Though in the Western countries, it will not be called adorable, but childish.
It's a culture that has a different tolerance for cuteness than Western cultures have. And we've seen that repeatedly throughout the second half of the 20th century. To some degree, it reflects the consumer power of Japanese girls.
Toru Iwatani was a young designer at the Japanese gaming company Namco before he created the first superstar in video game history.
26 years ago, 1980 was the year when Pac-Man was released. At the time, when we were developing Pac-Man, arcade games had a wild atmosphere, since there were only violent games like shooting games, and it was totally a guy's playground. But I wanted to pull in girls and couples into that place, so I targeted girls for a new game. We had gone through multiple topics, from fashion to boys, but since girls always have dessert after a meal, no matter what, we decided to pick the keyword eat. Then we were having lunch, and I ordered a round pizza. I took one piece, and there you go. There was Pac-Man, right there. So we decided to go with that.
The most important thing about Pac-Man or Pac-Man as we know it is that it was the first game to introduce a protagonist, which was a huge jump in the history of narrative in video games. And with that, it opened up a whole new world for developers and designers to get into and start creating characters that people could then associate with and identify with.
It also changed things up a lot, whereas a lot of the earlier games were, based around invaders and action and shooting. Pac-Man did something completely different. It was about eating. It's the best example of how something starts small with a game and just gets so huge that nobody knows how to stop it.
Manufacturers like Bally could hardly make the games fast enough. Every bar and restaurant and coffee shop in America seemed to want one.
It's the game most remembered, probably most beloved, that people get most nostalgic about. You'd be hard-pressed to find somebody in their 30s or even 40s, I guess, who doesn't have a story of having played Pac-Man.
Everybody playing. Men, women, children, families. It seemed like Pac-Man had taken over our lives.
Pac-Man is really kind of one of the beginning moments of merchandising, where you take something that was designed for a game and it blows up into something completely different, such as music or stuffed animals or little squishy toys and, cartoons, and suddenly he's got legs and he's doing all sorts of stuff, and then there's Ms. Pac-Man.
Honey, don't you know I'm more than Pac-Man with a bow?
ずっと長く愛されたゲーム。
Pac-Man has been loved and accepted for so many years, and sales never really dropped. 25 years have passed, but Pac-Man's still here. It's had an amazingly long run.
By the early 80s, it was clear that video games and the pixelated life forms they created were here to stay.
I think video games are an expressive and representative art form. I think that they represent our beliefs, our attitudes, the kind of core questions we're struggling with at a particular point in time. And I think they will be rich social documents. The challenge is how to read them. Because unlike a film, which the director makes a statement that's unified, a video game is subject to change depending on the player's choice.
A new world was emerging, and it wasn't just affecting the players of the games, it was affecting the creators too.
Atari was, I think, the epitome of the 70s Silicon Valley company. I mean, we sort of defined that kind of a lifestyle of not wearing suit and ties and still doing serious business, making money, a less regimented approach, and we treated our people very well because we realized that our assets went home every night.
We didn't care when they went to work. If they wanted to come in at noon and leave at midnight, that was okay. It was all about a true meritocracy.
You want to be successful. The single most important thing that you have to be is a doer.
But it was also the time of big money and big business, and Atari followed suit when Bushnell sold the company to Warner Communications.
The decision to sell it was as much out of fatigue as anything else.
For a while, it was a honeymoon, but as things progressed, they became uncomfortable with our kind of crazy management style and our parties and all the fun we were having making money.
But even with the new management, the Atari Brain Trust continued to move technology forward and began work on their first home console system, the Atari VCS.
What we had done with Pong was made a dedicated chip. That chip would only play Pong. And to build another game, we had to build a whole new chip. And every time you build a chip, it took about 9 months of engineering effort. So we had our research group up in Grass Valley create in 3 months the prototype for what became the VCS.
The VCS was renamed the Atari 2600. And after licensing Space Invaders from Taito in 1980, it flew to the top of every kid's Christmas wish list.
With the Atari, it was really like bringing the arcades home.
I got it for Christmas, and I sat down and played it so much that my dad's girlfriend had to come by and basically remind me that it's been 2 days later and I have to take a bath.
Atari made up to $100 million off of each of its titles. But the new corporate environment of Atari was slowly crushing the artistic foundation upon which it was built.
It's really interesting. There became a lot of anger between Atari management, especially after it was taken over by Warner, and the programmers, because you get paid $16,000 to $20,000 a year and you'd make the games all by yourself. And as these games became more and more profitable, there started to be a feeling among the game designers of why aren't we getting credit?
I'm afraid of empowering people. You know, I believe that people deserve their value in the marketplace. And so it was this real hierarchy that developed that we tried very hard to not have at Atari before.
Well, shortly thereafter, four of the guys left and formed a company called Activision and started selling their own cartridges, which were pretty good. And that became the end of the monopoly that Atari had.
I just became unbearable to the Warner management because I started calling them dumb and this is really not a good thing to do to guys who were from New York and wear suits. And it culminated in a board meeting in fall, and I quit, quote, was fired the following January.
Certainly Bushnell's life is better because of it, at least financially, but he is locked out of the business he started.
Atari still believed that being the biggest fish in a capitalist sea would keep the revenue rolling. Just like the financial swell of the 80s, they felt it was never going to end.
Success for Atari came so easy to the people that were calling the shots that they didn't feel like they needed to be careful, or they didn't need to be smart anymore.
Atari lost it.
The Atari video computer system.
Once you turn creativity into just marketing muscle, things get very dangerous because people get bored.
The game that a lot of people talk about is there was a version of E.T. made in 1983 that was so bad that Al Alcorn, who programmed Pong, who worked for Atari, says that he literally cried when he saw it.
The chairman of Warner cut a deal with Steven Spielberg where we paid him, I forget, a huge amount, $10 million or something.
It was created for cheap, very quickly, in no time, just to get it out and rush to market. Kids flocked to stores and bought this title and quickly found that what they loved on the big screen was terrible on the small screen.
Apparently, there were so many of these cartridges that we couldn't sell. We had to get rid of them somehow. And they wound up in a landfill, and the word got out, and then Atari then covered it over with cement to keep them out, and denying and said the cartridges were defective. Well, they were defective because we couldn't sell them. And so, yeah, it got pretty ugly towards the end.
Sales of Atari video games dropped off sharply. Somehow, Atari products...
1983 was the year of the great crash. In the late 70s, basically, when you talk to people who are making games at that point, they will say that making a game, you basically threw a game up in the air and you just waited for the money to fall down. So what you saw is that everybody tried to get in the market. You had so many competitors. You had dozens and dozens of companies. Public was deluged with games, and so many of them were so bad that it just turned the public off entirely to the medium.
No matter how great the graphics sounds are, still there's something a little bit boring right now about shooting a Martian or something.
The big crash. Not since 1929 has an industry fallen so far, so fast. The victim of oversaturation and changing...
In the end, the lack of quality games for the 2600 and the influx of games on home computers were too much. The gaming industry had matured into a legitimate business, but like any business, it was boom or bust.
If you don't obsolete yourself, somebody else will. And then Atari did die a sudden and painful and loud death, but I knew it was dead for me in 1981. It just took till 1983 for it to catch up with them and happen.
Stupid. I made more money shorting Warner stock, because I saw it coming, than I did on selling the company. No, that's a lie. But I did pretty well on shorting their stock, not more than.
The game was reset, and the proverbial door was wide open for anyone with a penchant for video games and a programming mind. The adventure had begun. By 1983, the American people had pulled the plug on the home console market. But on the other side of the political globe, in the communist regime of the former USSR, Alexei Pajitnov held the pieces to one of the most addictive games in video game history. Tetris.
early 80s were very dark years because it was absolute stagnation in politics. The moral climate were very dark. We didn't have any hope. We don't have too much entertainment. I mean, we have some movies, we have some theaters, but basically the life wasn't settled for entertainment. I spent 14 hours a day in my job, just playing with computer, like young hackers now.
In 1985, Alexei passed the time as a staff computer scientist at the Russian Academy of Science.
I realized that it's not what really interests me. My heart was in all this kind of small riddles, diversions, and puzzles.
You know, he conceived of this idea, the kind of mathematically pure idea of taking all the different ways you can configure a set of blocks together and then having those not simply put together in a normal 2D puzzle, but have them fall in motion.
I imagine pieces start falling down. You want to rotate them because that's very funny. Shift it and put it back. So that was the main idea of Tetris.
It was a different way for people to think in real time than other games. It used a part of people's brains that they aren't used to using in real time in video games. It was such an awesome idea that you really didn't need graphics to sell that game.
And by 1986, PC versions of the game appeared beyond the Iron Curtain. But Alexei had signed a 10-year license agreement for his game. Taking a cue from Atari, the USSR sold the game around the world and made millions from Alexei's creation.
Well, that happened with everything. So the people basically had no rights, and whatever they produced or did, everything was taken from them. I didn't want to fight for my rights. I would rather have the game out, published.
Play Tetris, my friends.
For all the Cold War posturing by the world's superpowers, Tetris was instantly welcomed into homes and offices across the globe.
If you play it enough, like I did when it first came out, you start dreaming in Tetris.
Tetris, I get Tetris vision. I look around the landscape and I go, oh, that would fit in there, you know. You really rearrange the world.
The beauty of Tetris, it's not really culturally specific.
And I think that's why it traveled all over the world, went on the handheld devices, and it was the game equivalent of the song that you can't get out of your head.
One side I kind of a little bit compromise all this serious computer business, but from the other hand, I got so much fun into this world that nobody could stand against.
In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and a few years later, the USSR.
There are scenes of extraordinary drama here in Moscow tonight.
The Cold War conflict that had launched video games was over. Alexei moved to America in 1991. And in 1996, the rights to Tetris returned to its creator.
Now I'm just by my own, and I do some small game design with my friends, and the rest of the time I just reading books and and enjoy myself.
Tetris and the fledgling years of video games emerged from the Cold War. Yet they laid the foundation for an industry and captured a timeless human need.
There's something about those games that transcends history and transcends national borders, because it brings us back to something fundamental about human imagination, about human curiosity, about the pursuit of pleasure that's so basic to who we are as human beings.
The technology changed dramatically, but human brains are still the same. So something which fascinates you 30 years ago is still interesting for you. The best old game will live forever.
As the golden age of video games came to a close, another was already in motion, led by a chubby little plumber who would take the industry to the next level.